The North Atlantic was a graveyard in the winter of 1943, and every man aboard the destroyer, HMS Starling, knew it. The cold didn't just bite at exposed skin during watch rotation. It seeped through wool and leather and settled into bones, a constant companion to the fear that lived in the pit of every sailor's stomach. Fear of the unseen enemy prowling beneath the dark waves, invisible and patient, waiting for the single mistake that would send you to the bottom in a coffin of twisted steel. Captain Frederick John Walker stood on the bridge that February morning, staring out at an ocean that looked like hammered lead under low clouds, and he was thinking about geometry. Not the comfortable geometry of classrooms and textbooks, but the brutal mathematics of death, the angles and curves that separated survival from annihilation when your enemy could strike from the depths without warning. Walker was 46 years old, though the war had aged him beyond those years. His face carried the weathered look of a man who had spent too many nights without sleep, too many hours calculating trajectories and probabilities, while younger men trusted him to keep them alive. The other captains in the Royal Navy's Western approaches command thought he was obsessive. Some thought he was mad. His methods didn't fit into the established doctrine that had been taught at the naval colleges before the war, the doctrine written by men who had never faced the wolf packs that now hunted in coordinated groups across the convoy routes. Walker had developed something different, something that looked chaotic and unpredictable to observers who watched his destroyer group operate. They called it the Zigzag tactic, though that simple name didn't capture the complexity of what he had created through months of experimentation and analysis. Through studying every failed engagement and every lucky escape, the Zigzag wasn't just random turning. It was a pattern based on predicting how a U-boat commander would think, how he would position himself for an attack, where he would expect his target to be in 30 seconds, in 60 seconds. Walker had realized something that seemed obvious once you understood it, but had eluded most anti-submarine warfare tacticians. A U-boat attacking on the surface or at periscope depth had to lead its target, had to fire torpedoes at where the ship would be, not where it was. The time between firing and impact created a window, a gap in which the future position of the target became the most critical variable in the equation. If you could make that future position unpredictable, if you could turn when the U-boat captain expected you to hold course, you could transform his carefully calculated firing solution into useless mathematics. But it required more than just turning randomly. It required understanding the rhythm of submarine attacks, the timing, the distances involved. Walker had arrived at this understanding through failure. Earlier in the war, he had commanded sloops in convoy escort duty, watching merchantmen die around him while his depth charges fell into empty water. The frustration of those months had driven him to study U-boat tactics with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He read captured German manuals. He interviewed survivors from sunken submarines. He built models and ran scenarios, trying to think like the enemy, trying to understand the geometry of underwater warfare from the perspective of commander peering through a periscope, making split-second decisions based on incomplete information. What he discovered was that U-boat captains were trained to follow patterns, to position themselves at specific angles relative to their targets, to fire according to established procedures that maximized their chances of success. These patterns were efficient and effective, which meant they were also predictable if you knew what to look for. The morning of February 17, 1943, began like dozens of others that winter. Walker's second support group, consisting of the sloop Starling and 5 other escort vessels, was operating in the central Atlantic, hunting for U-boats that had been attacking convoys in the area. Intelligence from Bletchley Park, the secret code-breaking facility, had indicated increased submarine activity in this sector, though the exact positions remained unknown. The ocean was vast, and finding a submarine without active contact was like searching for a shadow in a dark room. You waited for it to reveal itself, and when it did, you had only minutes to respond before it vanished again into the depths. Walker had been at sea for 12 consecutive days, surviving on coffee and brief periods of rest that couldn't properly be called sleep. His officers worried about his health, but none of them would suggest he leave the bridge during operation. They had learned that his presence, his immediate decision-making, made the difference between success and failure in submarine encounters. Focus. The first contact came at 920 hours, a faint trace on the sonar that could have been a school of fish, or a temperature layer, or the metallic echo of a submarine hull. The operator aboard the Starling called it uncertain, which meant Walker had to make a judgment. with incomplete information. This was the reality of anti-submarine warfare. You never had certainty. You had fragments of data, fleeting contacts, and the accumulated instinct that came from experience. Walker ordered the group to investigate, but he didn't charge directly toward the contact. This was where his methods diverged from standard procedure. Instead of heading straight for the suspected submarine position, he began the zigzag approach, altering course every few minutes in a pattern that appeared random but followed an underlying structure he had developed. The other ships in his group maintained formation, following his lead, though some of the newer captains found the constant turning unsettling. The submarine they were hunting was U-boat 268, though Walker wouldn't learn its designation until later. Its commander was an experienced officer who had completed several successful patrols and was now positioned to intercept a convoy expected to pass through the area within the next day. He had heard the propeller sounds of approaching escorts and had gone deep, trying to slip away beneath a temperature layer that would confuse sonar, but Walker wasn't relying only on sonar. He was using a combination of tactics, coordinating his ships to create a moving net that would force the submarine to reveal itself. The zigzag pattern served multiple purposes. It made his destroyer's future position unpredictable. Yes, but it also allowed him to cover more area, to probe different depths with his sonar, to force the submarine commander to make decisions and movements that might give away his location. For 3 hours, the hunt continued in a deadly game of prediction and response. The sonar contact would fade, then reappear, then fade again. Walker maintained his zigzag, never settling into a steady course that would allow the U-boat to calculate an escape route or a firing position. His crew was exhausted, standing at battle stations hour after hour, but they trusted his method even when they couldn't fully understand it. Other escort commanders operating in the area heard the sonar transmissions and wondered what Walker was doing, why he wasn't following the standard procedure of establishing a firm contact and then prosecuting it with a direct depth charge attack. Some later admitted they thought he was wasting time, that his erratic movements would only allow the submarine to escape. Then at 12:40 hours, the submarine made a mistake. It tried to change position, perhaps thinking the escorts had lost contact, perhaps attempting to maneuver for an attack. The movement created noise, a distinctive sound that the experienced sonar operators aboard the Starling immediately recognized as a submarine altering course at depth. Walker had been waiting for exactly this moment, the instant when the submarine commander's patience broke, and he tried to improve his tactical situation. The zigzag pattern had created pressure, had forced the U-boat to react rather than simply waiting in silent stillness. Walker immediately ordered a coordinated attack, directing his ships to positions that would trap the submarine regardless of which direction it turned. This wasn't a simple depth charge run. It was a choreographed sequence of attacks from multiple directions, designed to eliminate the submarine's escape options. The first pattern of depth charges went into the water at 12:47 hours. The weapons sank through the cold Atlantic, set to detonate at different depths, creating a three-dimensional field of explosive force that would damage or destroy anything within range. Walker had calculated the pattern based on the submarine's last known position and probable course, but he knew the U-boat would be trying to evade, would be going deep or turning hard, or both. This was why the zigzag approach. It had positioned his ships so that the submarine's evasion options were limited. Every direction the U-boat could turn, there was another escort vessel ready to attack. The ocean erupted in massive plumes of white water as the depth charges detonated, the concussive waves spreading through the water like ripples in a pond, except these ripples could crush a submarine's pressure hull if they caught it at the right depth. The crew of U-268 felt the shockwaves slamming against their hull, a sound like giant hammers striking metal. Lights shattered, equipment tore loose from mountings, men were thrown against bulkheads. The submarine's commander ordered emergency maneuvers, trying to dive deeper, but the destroyer group had anticipated this. Another pattern of depth charges fell, and then another, each attack coordinated to cover the area where the submarine would be if it was trying to escape. The mathematical precision of Walker's approach was invisible to the men dropping the charges, but it was there in the timing, in the spacing, and the angles of attack. He had turned anti-submarine warfare into a form of geometry where the submarine's position was the unknown variable, and the depth charges were equations designed to solve for it. At 13:11 hours, debris began surfacing. Oil, pieces of wood, fragments of equipment. The submarine was damaged, possibly destroyed, but Walker didn't assume success. U-boats had escaped before by releasing oil and debris to fake their destruction. He continued the attack, methodical and relentless, until he was certain the submarine could not have survived. The confirmation came hours later when bodies surfaced along with the debris, a grim verification that U-268 would not be returning to its base in France. Walker allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, but only a moment. There were other U-boats in the area, and his group needed to continue the patrol. The zigzag tactic had worked, but each success only proved the method for that particular engagement. The next submarine might react differently, might have a commander who had learned different tactics or had insights Walker hadn't anticipated. The second kill came 3 days later under different circumstances. Walker's group had been vectored toward a convoy that was under attack, racing through heavy seas to reach merchantmen that were dying under U-boat torpedoes. By the time the Starling and her consorts arrived, 2 freighters had already been sunk and the convoy was scattered, ships turning in panic while submarine periscopes moved through the debris field like sharks among wounded fish. Walker didn't attempt to restore order to the convoy immediately. His priority was killing the submarines, eliminating the threat before reorganizing the defense. This required a different application of the zigzag principle, adapted for a chaotic battlefield where multiple submarines might be operating and where the presence of merchant ships complicated the tactical picture. He identified the most likely attack positions based on the direction the torpedoes had come from and the current positions of the convoy ships. The U-boats would be trying to reload, maneuvering for follow-up attacks while remaining submerged and difficult to detect. Walker split his group, sending ships to different areas while maintaining a coordination that ensured they could support each other if a contact. His own ship began the zigzag approach through the area where he calculated a submarine would position itself for another attack. The pattern looked random to observers, but it was designed to force any submarine in the area to either reveal itself or abandon its attack position. The U-boat commander couldn't calculate a firing solution on a target that kept changing course unpredictably, and he couldn't remain stationary because the escort was systematically covering the attack zone. The contact came suddenly. A strong sonar returned from a submarine at periscope depth. The U-boat had been preparing to fire at a straggling merchantman and hadn't detected the approaching destroyer until the last moment. Walker's zigzag had brought him into the area from an unexpected angle, approaching from where the submarine commander hadn't thought to watch. The surprise was momentary, but in submarine warfare, moments determined outcomes. The U-boat went deep immediately, but it was too late. Walker had already ordered the attack, and his ship's depth charge crews had been ready, anticipating the command. The charges went over the side in a pattern Walker had personally calculated, adjusted for the depth and speed the submarine would likely be making. This U-boat, later identified as U-186, had a more experienced commander than the first. He executed a series of evasive maneuvers that might have worked against a conventional attack, turning hard and using the temperature layers to mask his position. But Walker had anticipated these maneuvers because he had studied how experienced commanders reacted under attack. The zigzag approach meant his ship was already turning, already positioned to deliver follow-up attacks from angles that cut off the submarine's escape routes. The engagement lasted 40 minutes, a brutal exchange where the submarine tried every trick its commander knew, and Walker countered each one with coordinated attacks that demonstrated a deep understanding of underwater tactics. When U-186 finally broke apart under the pressure of repeated depth charge explosions and the stress of deep diving, Walker felt no triumph, only a grim acknowledgement that the method had worked again. 2 submarines destroyed in less than a week, at a time when many escort groups went months without achieving a single confirmed kill. The other captains in Western Approach's command were beginning to pay attention. Some started asking questions about the zigzag tactic, wanting to understand how it worked, whether it could be taught to other groups. Walker tried to explain, but he found that the method was difficult to codify into simple instruction. It required intuition built on experience, an understanding of submarine behavior that couldn't easily be transferred through written doctrine. The third submarine encounter came 2 days after the second kill, and it was the most difficult of all. Walker's group was exhausted, having been at sea for over 2 weeks without returning to port. Supplies were running low, fuel was becoming a concern, and the crew was operating on fatigue and determination. But intelligence indicated that a U-boat was shadowing a convoy, transmitting position reports back to headquarters so that a wolf pack could be assembled for a coordinated attack. This submarine had to be eliminated before the other U-boats arrived, or the convoy would be slaughtered. Walker pushed his group to continue operations despite the exhaustion, despite the mechanical problems beginning to develop from the extended patrol. The U-boat, designated U-333, was commanded by a particularly cautious officer who had survived multiple patrols by avoiding direct engagements with escorts. He stayed at maximum range from the convoy, transmitting brief messages and then moving to new positions before radio direction finding could locate him. Walker realized that conventional anti-submarine tactics wouldn't work against this commander. He wouldn't be lured into attack positions where he could be trapped. He would stay cautious and alert, and the moment he detected escorts approaching, he would dive deep and disappear. The zigzag tactic needed to be adapted again, used not for a direct attack, but as part of a larger deception. Walker conceived a plan that relied on making the U-boat commander believe the escorts had lost interest in him. He ordered most of his group to remain with the convoy, maintaining obvious patrol patterns that suggested they were focused on close defense. Meanwhile, the Starling and one other ship detached from the formation and began a wide circling movement that would bring them to the area where the U-boat was likely operating. But approaching from an unexpected direction and using the zigzag pattern to avoid creating a predictable course that the submarine could detect and avoid. It was a gamble based on psychology as much as tactics. Walker was betting that the U-boat commander would become confident when he saw most of the escorts remain with the convoy, and that confidence would make him less cautious about his own security. The approach took hours, moving slowly through the dark Atlantic night. Walker maintained radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning and keeping his sonar in passive mode to avoid alerting the submarine. The zigzag continued even during this approach, though at a slower tempo, each turn calculated to bring the destroyer closer to the probable submarine position without creating a direct track that could be detected. It was exhausting work, requiring constant attention to course and speed, constant recalculation of position relative to where the U-boat should be based on intelligence estimates, and Walker's own analysis of the commander's behavior pattern. At 330 hours, still dark with the moon hidden behind clouds, the Starling's radio operator detected a brief transmission. The U-boat was reporting the convoy's position, and the transmission was close, closer than Walker had expected. The submarine commander had become bold, moving nearer to get a better count of the merchant ship. Walker immediately ordered action stations, but quietly, without the usual bells and announcements that might transmit through the water to alert the U-boat. His crew moved to their positions and practiced silence, loading depth charges, preparing the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, training sonar operators to shift from passive to active mode on command. Everything had to happen quickly once they revealed their presence, because the U-boat would dive and run the moment it detected the threat. Walker activated the sonar, and the ping echoed through the water, a sound the U-boat's hydrophone operator would hear immediately. The return showed a submarine at periscope depth, exactly where Walker had calculated it would be. The U-boat's commander reacted instantly, ordering a crash dive and emergency speed, but Walker had positioned his ship to cut off the most likely escape route. The zigzag approach had brought him in from the side, not from the direction the submarine would expect an escort to approach. The Hedgehog fired, sending 24 projectiles in an oval pattern ahead of the ship, each containing 35 pounds of explosive that would detonate only on contact with a submarine's hull. U-333's commander was experienced, but he had made the mistake of believing his caution had kept him safe. He hadn't expected an escort to approach from that angle, hadn't detected the slow zigzag approach through the night. The submarine was still turning, still accelerating when the Hedgehog projectiles entered the water. Most of them missed, sinking past the submarine as a dove, but two made contact. The explosions were sharp, distinctive, different from the deep rumble of depth charges. They punched holes through the pressure hull, and the submarine began taking on water immediately. The commander tried to surface, tried to save his crew, but the damage was catastrophic. U-333 went down by the bow, sinking rapidly into the dark water while men scrambled through flooding compartments toward the stern. Some of the German crew made it out through the escape hatches before the submarine reached its crush depth. Walker ordered rescue operations immediately, pulling survivors from the freezing water despite the risk that other U-boats might be in the area. This was something that set him apart from some other escort commanders. He viewed the German submariners as fellow seamen, men doing their duty just as his crew did theirs. The war was brutal and necessary, but it didn't require surrendering humanity. The survivors were treated with respect aboard the Starling, given dry clothes and hot food, their injuries tended by the ship's medical officer. Walker questioned them later, not for intelligence purposes but to understand their tactics better, to learn what he could about how U-boat crews were trained and how their commanders thought. 3 submarines destroyed in less than 3 weeks. 3 weeks. It was an unprecedented achievement at a time when the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its climax. Walker's zigzag tactic had proven itself, not as a single method but as an adaptable approach that could be modified for different situations and different enemy behavior. The success brought attention from higher command, and Walker was ordered back to Liverpool to brief other escort commanders on his method. He was reluctant to leave his group, feeling that continuous operations were essential to maintaining the pressure on U-boat operations. But orders were orders were orders. The journey back to port gave him time to think about what he had accomplished and what it meant for the wider campaign against the submarine. The briefings at Western Approach's command were attended by dozens of officers, many of them skeptical, despite Walker's recent successes. The zigzag tactic seemed too simple, too dependent on individual judgment rather than systematic procedure. Some officers argued that Walker had simply been lucky, that his 3 kills were the result of favorable circumstances rather than superior tactic. Walker listened to these criticisms patiently, then explained his thinking step by step, using diagrams and calculations to show how the method worked. He emphasized that the zigzag wasn't random, but was based on understanding submarine attack geometry and using unpredictable movement to disrupt the enemy's firing solution. He described the psychological aspect, how the constant turning created pressure on submarine commanders, forcing them to make decisions and movements that revealed their positions. Not all the officers were convinced, but some understood immediately what Walker was teaching. These were often the younger commanders, men who hadn't spent years training in the peacetime Navy's doctrine and were more willing to try unconventional approaches. Walker encouraged them to experiment, to adapt the basic principle to their own situations and their own instinct. He stressed that the zigzag wasn't a rigid formula, but a framework for thinking about anti-submarine warfare differently. The key was understanding that submarines had to predict the future position of their targets, and that by making that prediction impossible, you gained a fundamental advantage in the engagement. The impact of Walker's methods went beyond his own achievement. As more escort commanders adopted variations of the zigzag tactic, U-boat losses began to increase significantly in the spring and summer of 1943. Submarine commanders who had previously operated with relative confidence found themselves facing escorts that didn't behave according to the patterns they had trained against. The unpredictability made attack calculations difficult, and even experienced U-boat captains began to hesitate before closing to attack position. This hesitation, this uncertainty, was exactly what Walker had intended to create. Anti-submarine warfare was as much about psychology as technology, about getting inside the enemy commander's decision-making process and disrupting it. Walker himself returned to see operations as soon as the briefings were complete, resuming command of his support group and continuing the campaign against the U-boats. He refined his methods further based on each new engagement, developing additional variations of the zigzag approach for different tactical situations. His success rate remained extraordinarily high throughout 1943 and into 1944, making him one of the most effective anti-submarine warfare commanders of the war. But the continuous operations took their toll on his health. The stress, the sleep deprivation, the constant mental effort of outthinking enemy commanders wore him down gradually. He suffered from high blood pressure and other stress-related conditions, though he refused to acknowledge these problems or reduce his operational tempo. The zigzag tactics' influence extended beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. American naval officers studied Walker's methods and adapted them for use in the Pacific theater against Japanese submarines. Post-war analysis of anti-submarine warfare consistently cited Walker's approach as a turning point in escort tactics, a moment when doctrine shifted from rigid procedures to adaptive thinking. The principle of using unpredictable movement to disrupt enemy attack calculations became standard teaching in anti-submarine warfare schools, though the specific implementation varied depending on the technology available and the nature of the submarine threat. What made Walker's achievement remarkable wasn't just the tactical innovation, but the fact that he developed it through systematic analysis and experimentation rather than through access to superior technology. The ships under his command weren't more advanced than other escorts. His sonar wasn't more powerful. His depth charges weren't more destructive. What was different was how he used these tools, how he thought about the problem of finding and killing submarines. The zigzag tactic represented a shift in mindset, from viewing anti-submarine warfare as primarily a technology problem to understanding it as a psychological and mathematical challenge where human decision-making on both sides determined the outcome. The human cost of these successes was something Walker never forgot. Each submarine destroyed meant dozens of German sailors dead, young men who had families and futures that would never be realized. Walker understood the necessity of his mission, understood that those submarines would have sunk merchantmen and killed Allied sailors if they hadn't been stopped. But he never celebrated his victories or treated submarine warfare as a game to be won. His reports were factual and precise, listing the tactical details without embellishment or triumphalism. He respected his enemy even as he fought them, and this respect informed his tactical thinking, making him more effective because he took submarine commanders seriously as intelligent opponents rather than as targets to be mechanically eliminated. In July 1944, while at sea with his support group, Captain Frederick John Walker died of a cerebral thrombosis brought on by exhaustion and he was 48 years old and had been at sea almost continuously for months, driving himself and his crew to maintain pressure on the U-boats. His death shocked the Royal Navy and the wider Allied naval establishment. He had become a legendary figure, the man whose innovative thinking had helped turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The funeral in Liverpool was attended by thousands, including many of the officers who had served under him and who had learned from his method. His contributions to anti-submarine warfare were recognized officially with numerous honors and awards, but perhaps the greatest tribute was the fact that his tactical principles continued to be taught and used long after his death. The story of Captain Walker and his zigzag tactic illustrates something fundamental about warfare and innovation. The best solutions often come not from superior resources or technology, but from thinking differently about familiar problems. Walker had the same tools available to him as dozens of other escort commanders, but he approached the problem from a different angle, trying to understand the geometry and psychology of submarine attacks rather than simply following established procedures. His willingness to experiment, to analyze failures, and to develop new approaches based on that analysis made him exceptionally effective. The fact that other officers initially dismissed his methods as stupid or wasteful demonstrates how difficult it can be for established institutions to recognize genuine innovation, especially when that innovation comes from challenging accepted doctrine. The zigzag tactic worked because it addressed a fundamental vulnerability in submarine attack procedures. German U-boat crews were trained to calculate firing solutions based on target speed and course, launching torpedoes at predicted future positions. This training was effective against targets that maintained steady courses, but it became unreliable when targets moved unpredictably. By systematically destroying the predictability that submarine attacks depended on, Walker created a tactical advantage that didn't require better equipment or more ships. He changed the rules of the engagement by understanding those rules more deeply than his opponents did. This kind of intellectual approach to warfare, where understanding the enemy's decision-making process becomes as important as firepower or numbers, represents a sophisticated evolution in military thinking. The 3 submarines Walker's destroyer group sank using the zigzag tactic in that intense period of February 1943 were part of a larger shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. By mid-1943, Allied anti-submarine forces had gained the upper hand against the U-boats, sinking them faster than Germany could replace them, and making convoy routes increasingly safe. Walker's methods contributed significantly to this shift, not just through his own successes, but through the influence his tactics had on other escort commanders. The principles he developed through observation and analysis became part of the standard approach to anti-submarine warfare, saving countless merchant ships and their crews from destruction. What remains striking about Walker's story decades later is how a relatively simple idea, executed with intelligence and persistence, could have such significant impact. The Zigzag wasn't a miraculous innovation or a technological breakthrough. It was an application of logic to the problem of submarine attacks, combined with a deep understanding of human decision-making under pressure. Walker recognized that submarine commanders had to make assumptions about target behavior, and he systematically violated those assumptions. This approach required confidence in his analysis and willingness to persist despite criticism from those who didn't understand what he was doing. The fact that his methods were initially ridiculed by some officers only makes his eventual vindication more significant. The broader lesson from Walker's achievements extends beyond naval warfare. Innovation often comes from questioning accepted procedures and being willing to try approaches that seem counterintuitive to those trained in traditional methods. The officers who laughed at Walker's zigzag tactic were operating from established doctrine, from training and experience that had taught them certain ways of conducting anti-submarine operations. Walker's willingness to challenge that doctrine, to experiment and learn from results rather than following procedure blindly, gave him an edge that translated into operational success. This kind of intellectual courage, combined with the technical skill to implement new ideas effectively, represents the combination that produces breakthrough innovations in any field. Captain Frederick John Walker never wrote a comprehensive manual on the zigzag tactic or his broader approach to anti-submarine warfare. His methods were transmitted through example, through the officers who served with him, and learned by watching how he analyzed situations and made decisions. This person-to-person transmission of tactical thinking had its limitations, but it also meant that Walker's approach was adapted and modified by others who added their own insights and experiences. The zigzag tactic evolved beyond Walker's original conception, becoming part of a broader shift in anti-submarine warfare, thinking that emphasized adaptability and psychological understanding over rigid procedures. The 3 U-boats that went down under Walker's attacks in February 1943 represented more than just tactical victories. They were proof that individual commanders could still make decisive differences even in a war increasingly dominated by industrial production and technological development. Walker's mind, his ability to analyze and understand submarine tactics, his willingness to experiment and learn, these became weapons as significant as the depth charges his ships carried. The zigzag tactic demonstrated that warfare remains fundamentally a human endeavor, where thinking and decision-making determine outcomes as much as material resources. This remains true despite all the advances in technology and surveillance that have occurred since World War II. For the sailors aboard HMS Starling and the other ships in Walker's support group, the zigzag tactic meant survival. They trusted their captain's strange methods because those methods kept bringing them home after encounters that destroyed other escort ships. The seemingly random turning that confused outside observers made perfect sense to the men who saw how it disrupted submarine attacks and created opportunities for counterattacks. They understood through experience what Walker had proven through analysis. That unpredictability was a weapon, that keeping the enemy uncertain and reactive provided advantages that couldn't be quantified in simple metrics but could be measured in ships saved and submarines destroyed. The legacy of Captain Frederick John Walker and his innovative approach to anti-submarine warfare persisted through the Cold War and into the modern era. Naval officers studying submarine tactics still examine his methods and the principles underlying them. The specific implementation has changed with technology, with nuclear submarines and advanced sonar systems creating a different tactical environment than existed in 1943. But the fundamental insight remains valid. That understanding how your enemy thinks and makes decisions allows you to disrupt those decisions and gain tactical advantage. This intellectual approach to warfare, where analysis and innovation matter as much as firepower, represents Walker's enduring contribution to naval strategy. The winter of 1943 in the North Atlantic was a turning point, though the men living through it couldn't know that. The convoy routes were still dangerous, submarines still prowled the shipping lane, but the balance had shifted. Escort commanders were learning new methods, adapting their tactics, becoming more effective at hunting the hunted. Captain Walker's zigzag tactic was part of this shift. one thread in a larger tapestry of innovation and adaptation that eventually defeated the U-boat threat. But it was a significant thread, representing not just tactical success, but a different way of thinking about the problem, a willingness to challenge assumptions and try approaches that seemed wrong to those invested in traditional methods. Standing on the bridge of HMS Starling during those February patrols, watching depth charges explode in the cold Atlantic while calculating the next turn in his zigzag pattern, Captain Frederick John Walker couldn't have known that his methods would be studied decades later, or that his name would become synonymous with anti-submarine warfare innovation. He was focused on immediate problems, on keeping his ships operational, his crews alive, and the submarines away from the convoys they sought to destroy. But in solving those immediate problems through intelligence and analysis rather than just following procedure, he created something that transcended his own moment, contributing to victory in the Battle of the Atlantic and demonstrating principles that remained relevant long after the war ended. The 3 U-boats that sank under his attacks were defeats for their crews, tragedies for the families who would never see those sailors return home. Walker understood this even as he prosecuted the attacks, understood that war meant destroying people as well as machines, but he also understood the necessity, understood that failing to stop those submarines meant Allied sailors and merchant seamen would die instead. This moral clarity about the nature of his mission combined with tactical brilliance to make him exceptionally effective. He never lost sight of the human cost, while never allowing that awareness to interfere with his duty. The zigzag tactic that seemed so stupid to observers who didn't understand it turned out to be a sophisticated response to the geometric and psychological challenges of submarine warfare. It required extensive calculation, deep understanding of enemy procedures, and the courage to persist with unconventional methods despite criticism. Captain Walker possessed all these qualities, combining them in a way that produced results other commanders couldn't match using traditional approaches. His story reminds us that innovation often looks strange or wrong from outside, that the best solutions to difficult problems frequently violate established conventions, and that individual thinking and courage can still make decisive differences even in conflicts involving millions of people and vast industrial resources. The laughter of those who dismissed his tactics turned to respect as the submarines kept sinking, as the mathematics of the zigzag proved themselves in the cold equations of survival and death in the North Atlantic.